So, hey, I'm Langston Wilkins with Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We hold hundreds of events around the state each year, and you can check out our work at humanities.org. Today, we're here to talk about hip hop, which is one of the most pervasive musics and cultures of our time and a core part of our popular culture. Some people feel that hip hop is a new form of music, and that's true in some respects if you look at the history of Western and even world music. But this fusion of beats and rhymes has been around for over 40 years now, so it's been around a while. And hip hop is not only entertainment. Since its inception, marginalized communities, especially the Black communities that it originates from, have used hip hop to voice concerns and speak truth to power. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Hip hop as a form of protest, how artists and audiences have used the art form to communicate their experiences and bring about social change. And this is an especially relevant topic considering the ongoing and current Black Lives Matter movement and related social justice initiatives. Now we're here with two amazing panelists who are also part of Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, Eric Davis and Dr. Doughty Abe. And I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Doughty.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm a Seattle guy, a graduate class of 1988 of Garfield High School. I've been teaching, this is 90s, 2000s, 2010s. So it's my fourth decade in the field. Started off teaching kids in the 1990s, graduated, so to speak, up to higher ed, and I currently teach at Seattle Central College. One of the classes is hip hop theory and culture class, which is now going on almost 20 years old. I think it started in 2003. And kind of in the process of teaching that class, I've gravitated a little bit toward the scholarship aspect of it. If Professor Davis and I can call ourselves that, hip hop scholars, and that's kind of moved into the area of, like I said, kind of research and writing. And so in 2013, there was a book published, 6 in the morning, about West Coast hip hop. And in fall of 2020, there was going to be Emerald Street, the cover over my shoulder here, A History of Hip Hop in Seattle, foreword written by Sir Mix-a-Lot, published by University of Washington Press.
Eric.
Hey folks, this is Professor E. I go by Professor E, been going by that name for a long time. I used to work in Compton, California, or right south of Compton. Actually, it was Carson, California, on the other side of the 91 freeway in LA. And as I was going my way up and down the freeway to UCLA to do my undergrad ed, a lot of the hip hop guys in the community and the rappers in the community, they said they all had to have a name. I had to have a name. So they started calling me Professor E because I was always studying. And so I've been using Professor E for a while now. And even my students at Bellevue College call me that. So I'm associate professor at BC, teaching sociology, ethnic studies, started teaching a hip hop seminar class, a 2-credit class we just did last spring. And, back in the day, actually, when I was at UCLA, one of the things I did was created Rap 101. And so my Twitter hash is actually at Rap 101, which is basically using hip hop music to talk about subjects like this. And so did that speech, actually a lecture for Speakers Bureau a few years back. And my honor to be with you all again, and always good to see you, Brother Doughty.
So
the pleasure is mine. Trust me.
Good.
We're glad to have you both here. So sort of as a jumping off point, Doughty, can you give us a brief definition of hip hop and maybe talk about how it took root on the West Coast and even here in Washington State?
All right. So as I try to recreate the pre-recorded version I spit out there. So I would say that hip hop could be defined as the preeminent youth culture of the post-civil rights era. The four aspects of it, the verbal aspect of emceeing, the musical aspect of DJing, the written artistic aspect of graffiti, and the dance kinetic aspect of b-boying and b-girling, also known as breakdancing, help to form a vast interdisciplinary web that so many different subjects can be taught in school, and there are so many different ways for people to participate that it makes it probably one of, if not the most inclusive kind of cultural movements perhaps of all time. And it speaks to aspects of overcoming oppression, of struggle, of literally making something from nothing. And I think those are universal messages that, as we have seen over the last 40 plus years, have traveled and broken down just about any barrier or boundary you can think of between people.
No, thank you. Thank you. Eric,
I was supposed to talk about West Coast. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Professor Davis. Go ahead, and I'll talk about West Coast.
Only thing I would add is that, hip hop and rap music, the extension that is the musical aspect of it, obviously comes from the tradition of African American music and African music, from the Negro spirituals and even the music from Africa that came over with our ancestors. And so you have, the blues and things that we can directly trace to it. But again, the Negro spirituals are part of that. And as we get into our conversation about hip hop and rap, I think it's also important to note that if it's protest music, even if you're talking about something that isn't necessarily quote unquote negative, it's still protest when you're saying, swing low, sweet chariot, and you're trying to give a clue when we're leaving tonight, as a slave would do back in the day to hit the Underground Railroad. So all of these things are connected, and I think the history, unfortunately, so many people don't get that current day hip hop music is directly tied to the history of Black music. And we've always used our music to be the news. The way you can understand our community is to listen to our music. And so West Coast music, West Coast rap, Doughty was very different than the original stuff, right, in New York. And I would argue, biased as I may be coming out of LA at the time, was a big pivotal change when it comes to protest music. So I'll pass that one back to you, though.
Well, I just want to say, Eric, that's such a brilliant point you make, in that the existence of hip hop is protest. The simple fact that it's here. Rapper's Delight was a form of protest music, and it didn't necessarily say a single thing about protest as we know it. But the simple fact that it was a record that came from this culture and kind of opened the door to everything else that came afterward, I think is a fantastic point right there. So I'd say that probably, for the majority of the country and the world, the fall of 1979, which is when single Rapper's Delight, the 12-inch single Rapper's Delight was released by, the 12-inch single Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang was released by Sugar Hill Records. And so that's where it kind of begins to travel. That's certainly where I remember picking it up, the fall of '79, a place called Dirt Cheap Records, right? Literally a few blocks up from where I live right now in the Central District. But so as people start to hear it, as people heard it here, as people heard it wherever, Rapper's Delight I'm talking about, you're starting to kind of feel like, okay, first of all, after the shock of the vocals that we're not singing, at least again, just speaking from my experience, first time hearing it, and I'm like, why are they just talking? But then what they're talking about were things that were, I got a color TV so I can see the Knicks play basketball. That was something that spoke immediately to a kid like me, because we didn't have a color TV, and I love watching basketball. And so the little kind of points that they were making, and I think that specific reference there in terms of geographic loyalty is a very key point to highlight when we're talking about the travels of rap music, because at its core, rap music has always been about talking about who you are and what it's like where you're from. And so people in Seattle weren't going to be able to rap about subways and, 50-story tenement buildings and things like that, because that was not necessarily the reality of life here. And so as it starts to migrate, it starts to pick up different aspects of where it lands. And so if we're talking about somewhere like California, we're talking about like the southern part of California, people like Egyptian Lover and the World Class Wrecking Crew. And they didn't necessarily have the same style or sound that New York hip hop did. But that is one of the things that made Southern California in particular a place that, as New York was still the mecca for rap music for most of the 1980s, almost everything else that came outside of there was kind of compared to, well, it's not New York, it's not Run DMC, it's not, whatever. But Southern California was one of the first places that started to show other places outside of New York that you could do your own thing and not have to sound like whoever. And that's something, I'll get to Seattle in a little bit, because that's something that certainly played itself out in the music here. But so if you have people like Ice-T, who is putting the song 6 in the Morning out, which is kind of the acknowledged precursor to what became known as gangster rap, although Ice-T was doing that research for that 6 in the Morning book, was talking to me about how PSK by Schoolie D was actually the influence for him making 6 in the Morning. So there's lineage there. Schoolie D is from Philly. So we see that there's lineage in how the music travels. So you have someone like Ice-T puts out 6 in the Morning. You have World Class Wrecking Crew, which includes a young Dr. Dre before he gets to NWA. You can find some really great kind of interesting videos of Dr. Dre and World Class Wrecking Crew. And, he was very much into more of a Prince vibe than he was into a gangster vibe. So you have that. I think I said Egyptian Lover, and they kind of helped set the stage as the 80s go on for NWA and for MC Hammer and for people like Too Short and Digital Underground and Young MC. And I think that the great thing about the West Coast as it existed at that time musically was that there was the entirety of styles of music that you could be interested in. If you wanted PG, there's something to listen to in the car, you could put in, Young MC. Actually, and another kind of aside, I think is an interesting kind of evolution of the music is, as interviewing Young MC for that book, one thing that he told me I thought was fascinating was that during this time in the late 80s, he would have parents, a lot of times white parents, but sometimes black parents, come up to him and say, I don't let my kids listen to rap, but I let them listen to Young MC. And I thought that that was an interesting distinction between kind of the divergent elements of what would become kind of mainstream hip hop versus underground rap music. And so all of those things kind of help set the stage for, like I said, and the protest music that's coming out of there is very much linked to what was happening in the 1980s with the crack epidemic and the war on drugs and the 100-to-1 rule. And I'm kind of curious as to specifically, Eric, what you think about, because protest music within rap, I'm thinking of the most obvious examples like The Message. And that starts off very, I don't want to call it tame, but I'm just kind of thinking of it comparatively speaking to gangster rap. And I'm wondering, The Message was more passive, I think, just in terms of like kind of observing and, this is what's happening. And when it came to Ice-T and NWA, they were much more aggressive in terms of, less passive and like, here's what we're going to do about, the situation. And I'm just wondering how we categorize so quote unquote gangster rap as protest music. I don't know, does Boys in the Hood qualify as protest music, even though it was under the genre of gangster rap, and it kind of makes some allusions to it, whereas Fuck the Police is, there's no question that that's protest music. And I'm just curious as a native down there, your observations, because you were right in the midst of it and experiencing not only, the music as it was coming out, but the environment that was producing it all.
Yeah, that's a good point, because actually on my notes right next to me, I wrote down, the core song that comes to my head when I think of protest music and rap is The Message. And, I'm pretty good with music dates, and you might check me on my number, but I want to say that was what, 81-ish, 82?
I think 83, 82 or 83.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you got this situation where The Message comes out, and I agree with you. I think that it's interesting because The Message, the title says The Message. Let me tell you what's going on. And the hook, or the chorus, don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. So think about what that is, though. He's saying, here's what's happening. I got roaches in the front room, and all of these references to what's going on. I live in poverty. I live struggling. And here's what my life looks like. And you ain't seen it because you ain't been here, but here's what it's looking like. And I'm going to give you almost a play-by-play. Or if we use the news reporter analogy, right? I'm a news reporter. I'm telling you, here's what it looks like. But when it's time to talk about kind of the angst of it, to me, the angst comes out in that chorus where he's saying that ultimately his remedy at that moment is, I'm trying not to lose my head. It's on me. I'm wearing this, and I'm trying not to go crazy dealing with it. So maybe you'll empathize with me, right? Maybe you'll empathize. Whereas, NWA and folks like that, man, by the end of the first verse, Ice Cube's saying, I'm about to kill somebody. And I think there's a big difference. And I think that both will get your attention, but on some levels, to me, not on some, on a lot of levels, to me personally, the NWA 6 in the Mornings, the Cop Killer by Ice-T, the NU Love to Hate from Ice Cube, and many other songs he put out, America's Most Wanted. Those songs were so in your face that it made you react. And again, I referenced my, starting point back in the day was called Rap 101, because I'm in the classroom studying political science and studying ethnic studies and African American studies and understanding it from an academic space. But the visceral of it was so strong when you listen to it. I had a brother once who told me, I said, man, I don't like this NWA stuff, man. I was all in the Public Enemy. I don't like this NWA. I don't know why I had to cuss and all of that. And he said, man, NWA is the B-side of Public Enemy. It's exactly the same. Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. Right? I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it. It said they were suckers. They wanted me for their army or whatever. Picture me giving a damn. I said, never.
Never.
Ever. Right? So ultimately, that angst, he said, man, NWA saying the same thing. You need to listen beyond it. Listen past it. He said, gangster, listen to it, Eric. Listen to it. And,
what they're saying instead of how they're saying it.
Right. So do I look like an MF role model to a kid looking up to me? Life ain't nothing but just money. Mm-hmm. He's saying, y'all look and hear us. So, of course, the narrative, and I'll pass it back, is the narrative, of course, as we all know, or at least, maybe our audience doesn't know this, but I'll share a little bit and you can elaborate more. But you got the situation where NWA records that in 87, comes out 88, and, that first NWA album, Straight Outta Compton. And then the FBI ends up sending him a note saying, now, why would you say such a thing? And that's going to inspire violence against the police. The FBI sends a note. So, of course, NWA being NWA, they say, well, we'll make part 2. And we're going to come out with the second version. And that releases in 90. And March 91 is when you see the Rodney King incident. And the LA Times, I was in LA at the time, and the LA Times had an article in it. And it basically said, these guys are prophetic. How did they know? And Chuck D, said, what do you mean, how did they know? We've been telling y'all since The Message. We've been telling you, if you just listen, we are your CNN. Just listen and you will know. And so we're still not listening, and I'm not sure why. The music is telling us what's going on in our communities, and I don't know, maybe just people don't care. But it's not, Doughty is not right? It's not new. It's not new.
Not at all. And I think that, part of it could be the funkiness. People are hypnotized by the funk in some ways. I mean, I remember dancing to the message and like, oh, you know, the beat, you know what I'm saying, is undeniable. But it's also like, am I really out here dancing to a song where they're talking about roaches and rats and, you know what I'm saying, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat? I mean, you know, a song, the funkiness of a song like Fuck the Police belies its serious message.
Yes.
The undeniable beat of a song like Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos, you know what I mean? Now, all of those are very heavy stories that, because the music is so great, I'm just kind of speculating here. I'm just saying that, you know, the music is, the production is so exquisite that, sometimes it can make people, maybe for some people listening, hard.
Yeah.
But I just getting back to this other part of kind of pairing two FTP songs, F the Police by NWA and Fight the Power by Public Enemy, seem to be kind of two of the most iconic hip hop protest songs, probably there with the message as well. I think you could probably rotate those three, and, you know, they would probably be within most hip hop listeners' top 5, I would guess, of a certain age anyway. And that kind of thing. And so, you know, as it relates to how the spread eventually kind of came up here, you know, this was the same, Seattle area was the same way as Los Angeles or anywhere else that heard it and kind of was like, okay, how do we interpret this? What as we look around and we hear the words and the ways in which people from the Sugar Hill Gang are expressing where they're from, what does it look like and sound like as we do that kind of same thing here? And one of the first groups to kind of emerge in the scene is a group called the Emerald Street Boys, and they were like, you know, in early like early UTFO or early maybe even Houdini, before they became a group, you know what I'm saying, they were kind of dancers, and they would do, you know what I'm saying, at that point it was not necessarily so siloed where somebody would just do this. If you're just a rapper, you just rap. If you're just a DJ, you just DJ. If you paint, you just paint. You know what I mean? I fancied myself as all of those things, even though in the early 80s I couldn't DJ, but I, you know, still tried to get on a turntable at home and mess around, and, you know, so I'm just saying that there was an attraction to do more than one thing, and the Emerald Street Boys were very, you know what I'm saying, in terms of like, they would put on a whole show. They would do these intricately choreographed dance routines and everything. Now, very early on in the early, like 80, 81, were very much ahead of the curve. And there was a young kid at the time who was looking at the Emerald Street Boys perform, and his name was Anthony Ray, also known as Sir Mix-a-Lot. And that kind of inspires him. And he comes out and he finishes high school in the late 70s and never had any formal musical training, but is just good with systems and putting machines together and that kind of thing. Starts throwing parties at the Boys and Girls Club in the Central District right here in Seattle. And there is a Filipino American DJ on a radio station, KFOX, KKFX. And he had a show called Fresh Tracks, and that was the first all-rap radio show west of the Mississippi River. It premiered in 1981. He comes up, he hears about these parties, he comes up to the Boys and Girls Club, meets Mix-a-Lot, and invites Mix-a-Lot to come down and air his music on the show. That eventually leads to music, Mix-a-Lot's star rising. They formed Nasty Mix Records in 1985 and put out his album Swass, which contains the single Posse on Broadway in 1988. The album came out, and in 87 the video came out. And that video was very much an identity song for Seattle, as it kind of exported certain aspects of Seattle culture to the rest of the world. That video was on Yo MTV Raps. I would hear it. I went down to the Bay Area for undergrad in the late 80s, and I would hear it down there when people, you know, I don't know how well you know the song, but when people would find out that I was from Seattle and they listened to hip hop, they would ask me questions about Broadway. And they would ask me questions about like the burgers at Dick's. And those were like nuanced details of Seattle culture that you wouldn't really know. Those people wouldn't know anyway, if not for that song. And then so one other just point I want to highlight here about Sir Mix-a-Lot was one of the major points of this book is the geographic isolation and the ability that us being up here in this corner of the country, the freedom that that gives people artistically up here to not feel like they have to sound or be like somewhere else in some other part of the country. And this was certainly the case with Sir Mix-a-Lot. If you're thinking about, so that song, Posse on Broadway, was released in 1987. So this is right in the midst of the kind of the ramp up of NWA and Ice-T and kind of people coming with that real kind of explicit hardcore message that a lot of people were digging, myself included. But so in this key sequence in Posse on Broadway, they're up at Dick's and they get into a little beef with another crew, and the man is about to physically assault his girlfriend, and Mix-a-Lot intervenes with some mace. And that was kind of very much in the opposite direction that an NWA would go. They're not necessarily would have been known for stepping in, you know what I mean, to squash some domestic violence or solving any issues that they had with a can of mace. You know what I mean? And so him kind of going in the opposite direction was an example of that isolationism that allowed people to do things differently. And I'll just draw that line from Sir Mix-a-Lot in 1987 to someone like Macklemore in 2012, who comes out with two of his most popular songs, were Thrift Shop and Same Love. And those two things go directly against two of the most longly held beliefs in mainstream hip hop, which have been bling and homophobia. And so going against those, those two examples of going, and it really, even there's a third Grammy winner, if we're talking about Grammy winners, Diggable Planets, Butterfly is from here. And at the time that they win the Grammy for that song, The Rebirth of Slick, that whole concept of Diggable Planets, even though they were based in Brooklyn and kind of known as a New York group, Butterfly was the leader of that group, and they were talking about Marxism, communal living, and casting themselves as insects. And, those weren't things that a lot of rappers in New York were talking about. So I think littered around local hip hop, you can see examples of how people going against the grain have really been true to this kind of, not only the artistic spirit of Seattle hip hop, but overall an artistic spirit in this whole area.
No, thank you for that. I didn't realize that Seattle had a hip hop radio show as early as 1981. That's amazing to me.
Lots of details in this book, boy. Yeesh.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, if you two could talk a bit about we kind of already talked somewhat about this, what hip hop music can teach us about Black life in this country. Like, we talked about, police brutality in some ways through, NWA and Public Enemy, but maybe we can expound on that and talk about some of the explicit messages that's coming from the music.
I'll start on this one a little bit. And Doughty and I's paths, again, have crossed multiple times, many times, and we've been colleagues at Bellevue College, and Doughty was a longtime faculty member with us at BC and teaching classes in ethnic studies, one of our original faculty up at Bellevue College before I got there. And, it's interesting, Doughty, if you may remember from your time there, and I think these classes both existed, but I teach two classes. One is called the Sociology of Blacks in America, and another one is the Intro to African American Studies. And I'm using these two specifically for this reason. If you ask me to talk about the sociology of Blacks in America, there's things that I might talk about that are sociological, deviant behavior, family structures and systems, social stratification around poverty, et cetera, et cetera. If you're asking me to talk about the Intro to African American Studies, I often will tell the students on the first day, I ain't trying to talk about all that stuff. I want to talk about and celebrate Blackness. I want to celebrate African-American contributions to the society. And that may include, obviously, a conversation about protest music and NWA and Public Enemy, et cetera, et cetera. But what the difference is that, hip hop, as Doughty already said, is got this broad range. If you wanted to go PG and you wanted to get into just some dance music and bohemian stuff, you could just sit down with some De La Soul. And if you wanted to get into lyrical debates, just we brothers could sit around and just debate on lyrically who's the king or queen of this thing, right? And that would be a different conversation. And so part of the discussion for me on the protest music, again, the expression of Blackness and how African Americans have always had this ability through the elements of hip hop, dance, and art, and the b-boying, and I'm sorry, the DJ, and then the rap. Don't forget that DJ, and basically the reason I protest music is because they took records and turntables and made music out of them, right? And so this idea of how the culture has spoken to and is an expression of really gets to there's how we within the community look at the music and hear it and what it does for us. And I think that there's a difference on what the commercial heard version of it in society is telling people. And I think there's value for both. But let me just give you an example. I remember seeing the X-Clan at X-Clan back at UCLA. They came on campus. And they had the medallions, and all of us in the African American Student Union had our medallions, and we had our red, black, and green. We had the flags, and we all that, and it was Black pride for me. It was like my right. My time back then was to just wear the gear and be like very, very Afrocentric. And that was my level of protest, I guess, is the word at the time. And then, oh, there he is. Now you got to tell me where you got it from. And I had my medallion on 24/7 going to class. And that was our way of connecting. But when I left UCLA in Westwood and drove home to visit my parents in Carson, and I went to see my peeps who were, sprinkled around South Central. My dad worked at Locke High School in South Central. You were reminded that not everybody had the level of privilege that I had, and that I needed to pay attention to things that were going on again within and how this music was sharing outside of the community. So, I think, I'll pass it again on because I'm not sure I even answered your question, brother. But the thing is that there's going to be this music as it is experienced by those of us who live that experience, that life. And then there's the version that, the commercialized version. And sometimes I get real frustrated, and I ain't gonna even lie. And I'm gonna tell you straight up, I'm 51, and the young people out here, I ain't trying to offend y'all, but I'm not gonna lie to you either. I say some of that stuff is not rap music, it's crap music. I just, that some of the stuff, the rhyming skills ain't there. The storytelling ain't there. The metaphorical passages aren't there. So there's protest music, and then there's now this commercialized stuff. And so to go back to the core of our conversation, protest music, saying, hey, this isn't okay. That, to say Black Lives Matter obviously has a lot of power, but hip hop has been saying Black Lives Matter in various ways, whether it was me wearing my medallion and you matter, brother, I want you to stand up for yourself and you should be proud and here's your history. But what
the whole time.
Songs in the Key of Life. I remember the song Black Man on the 76 Stevie Wonder album that kind of went through and talked about all the different historical figures that made me proud to be a Black man in our society. And so it's a very interesting dynamic to kind of watch people who say, well, why would you say such a thing? And then I'm saying, well, why don't you know? And then at the other side of it, it's like, why do you need to listen to that? Why does that matter? Why do you need to listen to somebody like the X-Clan or some Afrocentric person who's telling you you're better than us? We're not telling, nobody's saying that. What we're saying is that for so many years, the history books haven't told us about who we are and where we come from and that we were kings and queens. So when I listen to, like I said, X-Clan, the Jungle Brothers, to me, that was not just protest music, but it's protest to some, but for me, it was building me up. It made me stand strong and tall. And I don't know, Doughty, what do you think? Help me out here, because
I think you and I are the same age, and for me, I always tell the students, this is not the student's fault. It's just a circumstance of when you were born. But I feel so privileged to have been born at the time that we were.
Yes.
And literally, I was telling you about getting Rapper's Delight. Literally, that was the first record that my dad turned me loose in the record store and was like, pick any one.
Right.
And I literally picked that record because of the design of the Sugar Hill
Right.
logo that looked like candy. I was 9 years old then, and that's literally why I picked that record. But I'm just saying that it goes without saying, I think, that, I was speaking earlier about how the simple existence of hip hop is protest.
Yes.
And over the last couple of months, if we're talking about, what does this tell us? What does this tell us about Black life and African American life? We're going over the last couple of months of protests since the incident in Minneapolis. And there's been a lot of reporting about just the weight and the myriad, the so many different ways that race matters and every single day for Black people and people of color. And we're made to understand it and feel it, even if not in direct ways. I think that if people who are not Black or not paying attention, not necessarily been paying attention, are seeing all of this, they may be like, because my wife said this to me the other day, just at the end of the day, it was just like, it is a miracle that Black people have done all that we have done in this country, given what we faced. And so I can imagine that some people who haven't been paying attention to this and are now seeing all these news reports and newspaper stories and kind of think pieces about whether it's healthcare or education or, you know what I'm saying, home ownership or whatever. It is so often skewed negatively in terms of outcomes for Black people. It's like, white people, I would imagine, at least anyway, have a little bit of critical thinking, and you have to be like, man, how have they done it? And how do they continue to do it? And I think that hip hop being at the core, if we're talking about like our age group, kind of like the golden era of hip hop, as hip hop scholars call it, they're roughly from the mid 80s to the mid 1990s.
Right.
I think the in my opinion, the vast majority of the greatest hip hop protest songs came out of that time because there was such a diversity of sounds and styles, and whether it was Night of the Living Bassheads by Public Enemy, which I definitely consider a protest song as it's outlining issues around the crack epidemic, or like you're saying, kind of like Gangsta Gangsta or Straight Outta Compton. All of those things, or Ice-T, Squeeze the Trigger. People who criticized that music just out of hand always struck me as odd, in that I never really understood why people were more upset about the representations of those conditions as opposed to the actual conditions themselves, which seemed a little bit backwards to me. But it also seemed like just a way to not really have to engage with what the actual problems are. And I think, I was being a little bit facetious about how the funk may hypnotize people out of actually doing work. But I think that it also, allows, some people are just, everybody's different, and not everybody is going to be moved. I had this odd thought when I was listening to NWA and F the Police, that if there were, and that was during the time when it was talking about, there were stories about how so many white kids were getting into hip hop and how many white kids loved NWA and that kind of thing. And I was wondering, well, maybe you'll have future police officers, who are going to grow up and maybe have this song, maybe give a little bit of a different perspective as to how they might do their jobs once they get up there. That kind of thing. I don't necessarily know that was ever the case, but I definitely had high hopes that the protest music of that era could actually make a difference. You're talking about X-Clan, E. Man, I mean, I still listen to the East Blackwards to this day, man. I was playing the Operation Snatchback, A Day of Outrage. You know what I mean? That a couple of days after the George Floyd situation. I mean, so I feel like that period, that golden era, had the most dense period of impactful kind of protest music from hip hop. And I think that was kind of in the time before larger label conglomerates took over and started kind of homogenizing all of the material that came out. And instead of trying to, because during the golden era, fresh was the operative word. You didn't want to necessarily sound like someone else. You didn't want to be accused of biting. You know what I mean? So you would go after different styles. And so I think that, you know, and these large corporations are not necessarily interested in artistic integrity. They just want to know what made the most money last time and how can we replicate that. And I think we've kind of been in that rut for what, about 25 years now, I think.
Yeah, and it's and you hit a point that actually you know, to really elaborate on what I was saying, Doughty, and that's and made me think, and it hit me. And that is that, you know, you said you just listened to X-Clan. What I listened to was Raise the Flag on that same album. And I listened to, but I also listened to Paris. And Paris was an artist.
The Hate That Hate Made.
The Hate That Hate Made. I listened to that song right afterwards. And I mean right afterwards. And I think that, I think it's important I'm okay to be transparent with folks who are watching this. And I think that it's important to understand, man, that when I watched the George Floyd video, my heart not just hurts, and y'all may be analyzing it and evaluating it and trying to figure out what happened.
I can't do it anymore, man. I can't within the last, man, I can't watch them anymore, man. I can't do it. It's too much.
I caught one today about a brother in Bloomington, Indiana, who was pushed up against a tree, and these brothers was yelling at him and calling him a nappy-headed bee and threatening to lynch him. And I have a visceral response. It's surging through my veins as I sit here with y'all right now, because every time people want to tell me to have hope that it's going to get better, and now things are changing, and that this George Floyd thing is set off this racial awareness and folks are waking up and all of these terms, I get that. I hope that's the case. But on an everyday basis, when I get in my car to go drive somewhere, I'm absolutely a Black man in this society, and not Professor E or a professor at Bellevue College or an educated dude. I'm Eric Davis, Black man. And, oh, but you're 51, it's not gonna happen to you. No, it can. And so what does that music do for me? And what does it do for many of us? It's a release valve. And, you know, at the end of, by the time I get to Arizona, which was Public Enemy's song that got banned by MTV, better fear while we're singing now, there will be the day we know who's down and who will go. And I think that y'all may not want to hear that. And y'all may not want to think, well, Professor E, you actually, you know, you willing to put that verse on this Zoom meeting and put it out there in the public space? I am, because y'all have to understand, man, this is hard for folks on a day-to-day basis. This is real. And when I listen to the Hate Made, I'm in my car, I'm the headphones on, and you need me to sing that song. You need me to be letting go of this energy and this angst, because I'm pissed off and I'm hurt that my children have to deal with this crap, that I have to deal with and worry about whether my boys are going to make it, that I have to give them the 10 and 2 rule and explain to them where to keep all of their data in the car so they don't get shot by the police accidentally. That's real. And there's no such thing as blonde lives matters, because blonde white women ain't getting shot unarmed. So yeah, you need Paris, and you need him to talk about that. You need him to have songs out there where he's just viscerally angry and letting it loose, and you need me to sing it. You need even Professor Eric Davis and Dr. Abe to sing it. You need us to, because it's very, very much a necessary release of some hurt and angst. And I think that's another part of protest, is that we have to do something with this energy. And I understand those and respect those who are marching, but I'm tired. Again, I've been listening to this for a long time, and we go back to what we started, the message. I've been listening to it for a long time, and I'm tired.
Think about the video. Think about the end of the video, the message. I mean, you know what I'm saying? The cop car pulls up and throws them all in the back of the police car. You know what I mean? And so that very early hip hop imagery was a clear kind of indication that this is a problem. The issues between law enforcement and the communities that they're supposed to be serving, there's an issue here, way back then.
Yeah. And I said, folks who are consuming now, my brother and I went to Bumper Shoot here in Seattle, you know, and we went there because it was the Roots, you know, greatest hip hop band ever, without question in my mind, one of my favorites all time. And for a group like the Roots, You gotta listen. They're 12 albums deep at this point. I mean, they got a lot. They got a huge discography. But you have to listen, and they will. There's some people like Black Thought who will throw nuggets in, and then we often will look at protest music as only those songs which the whole content of the song.
Right.
But even Kanye, when he says, just because you're in the Benz, you still in a coupe. All falls down. That's protest.
Protest lines.
That's a protest line. That's a verse he throws at you. Jay-Z will throw one in there. He may not throw the whole song content that way, but he'll throw one at you here and there. And even he will have a few, again, songs that'll do that. De La Soul will throw little notions in there and drop them on you. And when we look at, so I'm at Bumbershoot, right? We're waiting for the Roots. And so we're hanging out. We see Big Wild and, this white dude who's doing beats. I'm like, wow, look at that. And then E40 came out.
E40 from the beat?
E40, So and I saw this 98% white crowd at the Seattle Center, pre-COVID, obviously. They knew every line. Every line. And me and my brother just turned and looked at each other like, are you seeing this? But you could tell they just knew the lines, but they weren't thinking. They just knew the words. They weren't thinking. They just knew the words, to the point where, of course, they throw the N-word in there, which is a whole nother conversation for another day. But what does that mean? You're listening to it, but are you hearing?
You're not hearing it. They're not hearing it. They're listening, but they're not hearing it. And that's kind of going back to what I was saying about the hopefulness in the late 80s about, would the power of this music and this culture kind of be able to kind of push and be the igniter of change. And I think that it has to a certain extent, but certainly had lived up to the lofty hopefulness that I had for it. But I mean, it's all, and also sometimes I have to tell my children and even remind myself, man, that what we're talking about is trying to reverse 400 plus years.
Right.
And we've only even been having these critical conversations for less than 50 or 40?
Right.
And so, it's never going to go as quickly as I would like it to, but, I have to try to take encouragement from what we're seeing here, because I don't know what you guys think, but this is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime, just in terms of the number and level of people who are at least seeming to give lip service. And even if it is lip service, it has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And you hope that lip service eventually turns into policy. But I don't know. I mean, we didn't really talk about this before we came on, but I'm a little interested in what you kind of think, both of you, about where we are right now.
I'll give it to you, Langston.
Wow, where we are. Wow. I don't know. I think I'm cautiously optimistic, maybe. Like you said.
Feel the same way.
Yeah, I've seen different people, institutions, organizations, all over the country and world, talk about, the problem of police violence and general racial oppression in this country. And that's something I've never seen before and something I never thought I would see. However, I worry that, like you kind of said, it won't get past lip service. There is some real structural movements being made right now, and that's awesome. But I worry that, next year around this time, when something else has happened in this world, we're not going to be talking about this anymore. That's what I really, really worry about. So cautiously optimistic. I'm not holding my breath, but, I'm willing to see where this goes and how it plays out. I guess that's where I am. You know what I mean? Give it to you, Eric.
Yeah, what struck me about what you said is that, when the next news cycle comes through, is this going to hold? Now, the good news, to Doughty's point, is that several news cycles, several attempts to wag the dog from a certain idiot president of ours have not worked and have not moved the conversation or diverted the conversation to something else. So it's holding a lot longer than historically I've seen in my own time, and it's a relative young time in life, that in the history of the world, I've not been here very long, but obviously in my own lived experience, this is the first time I've seen it actually hold this long and this much strength of conviction to make this thing a difference, to change it. But that being said, what you also noted is that, will people stop talking about it? Probably, but will our artistic elements in Black culture stop talking about it? And the history of hip hop has shown us that we're going to keep talking about it, and you're going to still hear us doing it. Unfortunately, you got to go a little deeper. You got to dig a little deeper into crates, the virtual crates as they were, to get to the protest music. I would feel completely remiss if I didn't mention someone like an Odyssey, who's coming out of DC. And, he's got a song called Like Really. And, and he has songs that often will talk to social issues. And so folks who are watching this haven't checked out somebody like an Odyssey. He is carrying on the tradition of the Dead Prez and others who have spoken to this, and the history of the others that we've already mentioned, in addition to, like I said, an Odyssey, Dead Prez, and people came so an Odyssey's out here now doing it and still telling the stories. And you're going to have to go find those folks. You're going to have to dig into crates to find them now, because mainstream music and the radio stations and the hot this and the hot that are not necessarily going to play it. You're going to have to call, Brother Abe and say, hey, Doughty, what you listening to right now? And again, depending on if the day, you might catch him listening to X-Clan, another day.
All right. Hey, man, you want I'm listening to right now? I'm listening to By All Means Necessary by Boogie Down Productions.
Yeah.
1988. And I mean, that album stands up. Oh, my goodness. And so.
My philosophy.
Yeah, so I illegal business, Jimmy talking about safe sex. I mean, it's unbelievable. But I think that I am sometimes guilty of not always listening to newer music. I enjoy the golden era. I'm gonna just go ahead and say it. All right. I listen to the DOC a lot, and I listen to, like I said, X-Clan, and I listen to, okay. However, I think that there is use for younger people or even older people to kind of go back and visit. Specifically, I'm thinking around the time of the Rodney King situation. Maybe because Rodney King it was very similar in terms of not the exact incidents, but the only difference maybe was that Rodney King was not beaten to death. If he'd have been beaten to death, that might have been made a little bit different, but he was still around to kind of deliver the "can't we all get along" statement. So the death of George Floyd may have added a different dynamic here. But after the trial of the officers in Simi Valley, where they were acquitted, you have this kind of flurry of songs like the day the niggas took over by Dr. Dre, and we had to tear this MF up, that kind of gives some rear view look. So it's and we actually do this in the hip hop class. There's a section, a unit that we do on West Coast hip hop in the Rodney King situation, and they're doing some reading and listening and watching of videos kind of in the lead up to it, and then maybe a documentary about the actual, and then kind of the music afterward, to kind of give the bookends of, because like you were saying, the LA Times essentially was like, these guys are prophets. These guys knew exactly what was going to happen, because when the Rodney King video came out, it was kind of like NWA type cats were like, see, this is what we were talking about.
It literally said it.
Yeah, it gave them tremendous credibility, and I think that people now, whether they're familiar with that whole era and listening or they're not, I think it's highly instructive about what's going on, because so much of the sentiments expressed in those songs are exactly on point for what's still happening today. So I think that there's usefulness in kind of going back and revisiting the music and events of that era and using them to help inform where we're at right now.
Well, cool. I think that's a good place to stop. This has been a great conversation about hip hop and protest, and kind of a general discussion about where we are as a country. I'd like to thank both of you, Professor E, Eric Davis, and Dr. Daudi Abe, for joining us today. Rest in peace, Jam Master Jay, for real. Run DMC. So yeah, this is Langston Wilkins with Humanities Washington. Again, please check out our work at www.humanities.org, and we'll see you soon.